Marcus Freeman's first breath of freedom tasted like Daniel Cross's name. 20 years dissolved behind steel doors for a sin that belonged to another man's hands, another man's conscience, another man's nightmares that somehow became his own. The system took his youth, his marriage, his daughter's childhood, and gave him nothing but the knowledge that the real killer built an empire on the foundation of Marcus's stolen decades. Now he stands at Daniel's door in Detroit, carrying not a weapon, but something far more terrifying, irrefutable proof and the moral high ground that comes from surviving hell without becoming the devil. The choice between revenge and justice will be made in the next 60 seconds, and Daniel Cross, respected businessman, devoted father, pillar of the community, is about to learn that some debts cannot be buried under success and time. Subscribe to witness what happens when a man who lost everything chooses the one thing his destroyer never expected. The keys felt strange in Marcus Freeman's hand, too light to represent what they meant, too ordinary to signify the end of 20 years, 240 months, 7,300 days of breathing recycled air behind walls that never acknowledged his innocence. He stood on the prison steps in Jackson, Michigan, the afternoon sun pressing against his face with an intimacy he'd forgotten, warmth without bars, slicing it into geometric patterns across his skin, and he realized he didn't know how to simply walk forward without asking permission first. The guard who'd processed his release had handed him the manila envelope containing $87, a bus voucher, and the clothes he'd been arrested in, now loose on a body that had learned to carry rage like a second skeleton beneath the first. Marcus looked at the parking lot where other released men stood smoking cigarettes with the desperate intensity of people trying to taste freedom through their lungs, and he knew he wasn't going to the halfway house they'd assigned him, wasn't going to report to the parole officer whose address was scrawled on the paperwork, wasn't going to pretend that freedom meant following another set of institutional rules designed by people who'd never spent a single night wondering if they'd die in a cage for someone else's crime. His first stop had been decided 20 years ago, crystallized in the moment the verdict was read, and he'd seen Daniel Cross in the back of the courtroom, watching with eyes that held neither guilt nor relief, but something worse, indifference. The number 4757 Maple Ridge Drive was burned into Marcus's memory with the permanence of a brand. And now, with the late October wind pulling leaves across the prison grounds like prayers no one would answer, he began walking toward the bus stop, toward Detroit, toward the confrontation that had been rehearsed in his mind so many times that it felt less like planning and more like prophecy. The Greyhound bus smelled like stale coffee and the collective exhaustion of people who traveled because they had to, not because they wanted to. And Marcus took a seat near the back, pressing his face against the window as the Michigan landscape rolled past in a blur of dying autumn colors and strip malls that hadn't existed when he'd last been free. The woman beside him, elderly and wearing a cross that caught the light every time she breathed, tried to make conversation, asking him where he was headed with the gentle nosiness of someone who'd spent a lifetime believing that strangers were just friends who hadn't introduced themselves yet. Marcus gave her one-word answers, polite enough to discourage further questions, but not harsh enough to seem dangerous. Because he'd learned in prison that the ability to modulate threat was a survival skill more valuable than physical strength, that men who broadcast their violence rarely lasted as long as men who kept it coiled and hidden until the moment required its release. She eventually fell asleep, her head tilting against the window, and Marcus envied her that capacity for rest, for surrender to the simple animal need for sleep without the hypervigilance that prison had welded into his nervous system like armor he could never fully remove. Outside, the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him of the one sunset He'd been able to see clearly from his cell window, through a gap in the building across the yard. 3 years into his sentence, when he'd still believed that appeals and evidence and truth might somehow penetrate the bureaucratic indifference of a system that had already filed him away as solved, as closed, as someone else's problem. He'd watched that sunset and made a promise to himself, a vow that had sustained him through the beatings from guards who enjoyed their power too much, through the loneliness that sometimes felt like suffocation, through the birthdays and Christmases and ordinary Tuesdays that his daughter Sarah had lived without him while he counted ceiling tiles and memorized the patterns of footsteps in the corridor outside his cell. Detroit rose in the distance like a city trying to remember its own greatness. Abandoned factories standing alongside new developments in a landscape of contradiction and survival. And Marcus felt something tighten in his chest as the bus crossed into the city limits. This was the place where his life had shattered, where he'd been arrested outside the convenience store at 2 a.m. after working a double shift at the warehouse, where witnesses who'd never actually seen the crime had somehow identified him with certainty, that the jury found more convincing than his alibi, his clean record, his tearful testimony that he had a 6-year-old daughter at home and a wife who needed him, and no reason at all to assault and rob a man he'd never met. The prosecutor had painted him as desperate, dangerous, driven by economic pressure to violence, and the public defender assigned to his case had been so overworked and underpaid that Marcus's innocence had become just another file in a stack too tall to properly examine. Daniel Cross had been questioned briefly because he'd been in the area that night, but he'd had an alibi, his wife confirming he'd been home, his business partner vouching for his character, and the police had moved on, satisfied with Marcus, with the black man who fit their profile and their prejudices, with the easy solve that let them close the case and move on to the next tragedy in a city that produced them with industrial efficiency. Marcus had spent the first 5 years of his sentence believing that someone would finally listen, that evidence would emerge, that justice delayed was still justice possible, but year 6 had taught him that the system wasn't interested in admitting mistakes, and year 7 had shown him that innocence was less powerful than institutional inertia. The bus pulled into the downtown station as evening settled over the city, and Marcus stepped onto the platform with legs that still expected doors to clang shut behind him, still anticipated the voice of authority telling him where he could and couldn't go. He had $200 now. The prison had paid him for the work he'd done in the laundry facility. 13 cents an hour for 20 years, adding up to something that felt like an insult and a joke simultaneously. He bought a city map from a vending machine and studied it under the fluorescent lights of the station, tracing the route from downtown to Maple Ridge Drive with a finger that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of what he was about to do. The confrontation that had lived in his imagination for so long that he almost couldn't believe it was about to become real. Other travelers moved around him, rushing toward connections and reunions and ordinary destinations, and none of them knew they were standing next to a man who'd been erased from the world for 2 decades, whose daughter was now 26 and had stopped writing him letters after her 18th birthday, whose wife had divorced him in year 12 and remarried someone who could actually be present for school plays and anniversaries and all the mundane, sacred moments that constitute a life. Marcus folded the map and walked toward the taxi stand, toward the next stage of a journey that had been forced upon him by a man who'd chosen convenience over conscience, who'd let an innocent person shoulder the consequences of his actions, who'd built success on the foundation of Marcus's stolen years. The taxi driver, a Somali immigrant whose dashboard was decorated with prayer beads and a photograph of children Marcus assumed were his own, didn't ask questions when Marcus gave him the address on Maple Ridge Drive. They drove through neighborhoods that bore the scars of economic collapse and the tentative signs of gentrification, past houses that ranged from abandoned to meticulously restored, through a geography of inequality that Marcus recognized from his life before prison, when he'd worked honest jobs for wages that never quite stretched far enough, and dreamed of something better for Sarah. The driver played music Marcus didn't recognize, something in a language that sounded like longing translated into melody, and Marcus thought about how strange it was that some people's suffering produced art while his had produced only endurance, only the grim determination to survive each day without letting the bitterness completely calcify his heart. He'd met men in prison who'd let the injustice consume them, who'd become hollowed-out versions of themselves, animated by rage alone. And Marcus had decided early on that he wouldn't give the system that final victory, wouldn't let them take his humanity along with his freedom. He'd read every book the prison library offered, had taken correspondence courses when he could afford the fees, had maintained relationships with the few people on the outside who still believed in his innocence. His sister Diane, his old friend Raymond, the journalist who'd written a series of articles about wrongful convictions and had included Marcus's case among dozens of others that collectively illustrated a justice system more interested in conviction rates than truth. The taxi turned onto Maple Ridge Drive as darkness completed its conquest of the day, and Marcus saw the houses here were the kind that represented arrival, that signaled someone had made it out of struggle and into stability, with manicured lawns and two-car garages and the kind of quiet that comes from financial security. Number 4757 sat mid-block, a colonial-style home with white siding and black shutters, lights glowing in the windows like a magazine photograph of domestic tranquility, and Marcus felt his heartbeat accelerate as the taxi pulled to the curb. He paid the driver with bills that felt like play money in his hands, stepped out onto the sidewalk, and stood for a moment simply breathing, simply existing in the space outside the home of the man who'd destroyed his life, with a lie of omission, with silence when truth was required, with the cowardice of self-preservation at another human being's total expense. The folder he carried contained copies of everything, the evidence that a private investigator named Patricia Chen had helped him compile over the last 3 years, working pro bono after reading about his case, tracking down witnesses who'd been ignored, finding security footage that had been conveniently overlooked, building an alternative narrative that pointed unambiguously toward Daniel Cross. Marcus had almost gone to the police first, had almost followed the proper channels, but he'd learned through brutal experience that proper channels had a way of protecting people like Daniel, while grinding people like Marcus into statistical irrelevance. And he needed Daniel to know, needed him to understand with absolute clarity that his perfect life was built on sand, that truth had a way of emerging even when buried under 20 years of lies. Marcus stood on the sidewalk for 7 minutes before he began walking toward the house, his legs moving with a strange mixture of purpose and reluctance, as if his body understood that crossing the threshold of Daniel Cross's property would irrevocably change both their lives, would set in motion consequences that couldn't be recalled or reconsidered once words were spoken and knowledge transferred. The pathway from the street to the front door was lined with solar lights that flickered on as dusk deepened into night, creating a gauntlet of illumination that felt both welcoming and exposing. And Marcus was suddenly aware of how he must look. A man in clothes that didn't quite fit, carrying a worn folder, approaching a house that obviously didn't belong to him in a neighborhood where his presence would be noted, questioned, remembered. He'd spent 20 years becoming invisible in prison, learning to occupy space without drawing attention, without triggering the predatory instincts of men who needed targets to assert their dominance. And now he was deliberately making himself visible, deliberately placing himself in the trajectory of a reckoning that had been building since the day the jury foreman had said the word guilty, with the casual finality of someone ordering lunch. The porch steps creaked under his weight, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet street, and Marcus found himself standing before a door that had a decorative wreath hanging from a brass knocker, seasonal and cheerful and utterly disconnected from the purpose that had brought him here. He raised his hand to knock and then hesitated, momentarily paralyzed by the surreal nature of what he was about to do. The confrontation between the man who'd lost everything and the man who'd gained everything through the simple expedient of staying silent while another human being was crushed by the gears of a system that valued efficiency over accuracy. Inside the house, Marcus could hear the muffled sounds of a television, the ordinary domestic symphony of a Thursday evening in America, and he thought about all the Thursday evenings he'd missed. All the mundane, beautiful moments that had been stolen from him while Daniel Cross ate dinners with his family and tucked his children into bed and made love to his wife in the comfortable certainty that his secret was buried too deep to ever be excavated. Marcus's knuckles made contact with the door. 3 sharp raps that sounded like an execution drum in his own ears. And then he waited, his breath coming faster now, his hands beginning to shake with the physiological response to confrontation that 20 years of forced passivity hadn't completely eliminated. He heard footsteps approaching from inside, heard the slight pause that suggested someone was checking the peephole, and then the door began to open, swinging inward to reveal Daniel Cross standing in the amber light of his entryway, wearing casual clothes that probably cost more than Marcus had earned in his last year of freedom, his face showing the comfortable aging of a man who'd never spent a night in a cell, who'd never had to fight for shower privileges or eat food designed to meet minimum nutritional requirements while tasting like punitive cardamom. Daniel's expression went through a rapid evolution in the space of 3 seconds. Mild curiosity giving way to confusion, confusion sharpening into recognition, recognition collapsing into something that looked like genuine terror, and Marcus watched this transformation with a satisfaction that was almost physical, almost sexual in its intensity, because for 20 years he'd imagined this moment, and now it was real. Now Daniel Cross was standing before him with his mouth slightly open and his eyes widening in a panic that Marcus recognized from his own reflection during the trial, during the sentencing, during the first night in his cell, when the reality of what was happening finally penetrated the shock that had been protecting him. Marcus didn't speak immediately, just stood there, letting the silence stretch and tighten, letting Daniel's mind race through possibilities and calculations and desperate searches for explanations that might make this apparition less catastrophic. The air between them felt charged with the accumulated voltage of 2 decades of injustice, of one man's suffering and another man's prosperity purchased with that suffering as currency. And Marcus understood in that moment why people believed in concepts like karma and divine justice, because the universe seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when truth finally confronted the lie that had sustained itself through sheer inertia and institutional incompetence. Daniel's voice, when he finally found it, came out thin and uncertain, stripped of the confidence that probably characterized his business negotiations and social interactions, reduced to the vulnerable sound of a man who'd always known this moment might come, but had convinced himself through years of successful denial that it never actually would. He said Marcus's name like a question, like maybe if he expressed enough uncertainty, the reality standing on his porch might dissolve into something less threatening, something manageable, something that could be explained away or bought off or reasoned with using the skills that had made him successful in the legitimate world he'd built on top of his buried crime. Marcus just nodded, still silent. still letting the weight of his presence do the work that words couldn't fully accomplish. And he saw Daniel's eyes dart past him to the street, checking to see if Marcus had come alone, if there were police cars waiting, if this was the beginning of something official or something personal, something that could be negotiated or something that was simply going to happen, regardless of what Daniel wanted or feared. The television in the background was playing a comedy show, the laugh track providing a surreal counterpoint to the tension on the porch. And Marcus thought about how strange it was that life continued in its banal routines, even as individual worlds collapsed. That somewhere in this house, Daniel's family was probably going about their evening, unaware that everything was about to change. That the man they trusted and loved and built their lives around was about to be revealed as something fundamentally different from what they believed him to be. Marcus finally spoke, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended, graveled with 20 years of suppressed emotion and the simple fact that he hadn't had many opportunities for extended conversation in an environment where words were weapons and silence was often the safest policy. He said, "We need to talk, Daniel." And the use of the first name felt both intimate and accusatory, a refusal to grant the distance that formal address would have provided. A reminder that they were connected by history and crime and consequence in ways that couldn't be dissolved by time or success, or the comfortable lies that Daniel had probably told himself about the man who'd paid for his freedom. Daniel's hand tightened on the doorframe, his knuckles going white with the pressure, and Marcus could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, the rapid assessment of risk and options and potential outcomes, the desperate scramble for a strategy that might contain this situation before it metastasized into something that consumed everything he'd built. Marcus held up the folder, not threateningly, but with the quiet authority of someone holding cards that couldn't be trumped, and said, "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because you need to know that I know, that I've always known, and that now I can prove what you did, what you let happen to me while you went on living like none of it mattered." The words hung in the air like an indictment, like a prophecy, like the sound of a life shattering into fragments that could never be reassembled into their previous configuration. Daniel's face went through another transformation, the fear deepening into something that looked almost like grief, like the recognition that the comfortable lie he'd been living was about to be stripped away and replaced with a truth that would redefine everything: his past, his present, his future, his identity, his relationships. His understanding of who he was and what he'd done and what prices other people had paid for his choices. He stepped back from the door, not quite an invitation, but an acknowledgement that Marcus wasn't going to simply disappear, that this confrontation was going to happen whether Daniel wanted it to or not, and Marcus took that step backward as permission to enter, crossing the threshold into a home that smelled like dinner recently cooked and laundry detergent and all the ordinary scents of a life being lived in comfort and security, the life that should have been Marcus's own if Daniel had possessed even a fragment of the courage required to tell the truth when it mattered. The entryway was decorated with family photographs on the walls, Daniel with a woman who must be his wife, children at various ages smiling with the unself-conscious joy of people who'd never had to question whether their father was who he claimed to be. And Marcus felt a complicated emotion looking at these images. Not exactly envy, not exactly anger, but something more complex. A recognition that innocent people were about to be hurt by the revelation of Daniel's guilt. That justice for Marcus would necessarily mean suffering for people who'd done nothing wrong except love a man who'd built his entire life on the foundation of another man's destroyed one. The door clicked shut behind them, and Marcus understood that they were now enclosed in the space where truth would finally be spoken, where 20 years of silence would end, where Daniel Cross would have to face what he'd done and what it had cost. Daniel led Marcus through the entryway into a living room that bore all the markers of upper-middle-class success. Leather furniture that looked both expensive and comfortable. Artwork on the walls that suggested taste and investment. A bookshelf filled with hardcovers that may or may not have been read, but certainly signaled intellectual aspiration. And Marcus found himself cataloguing these details with the analytical detachment of someone who'd spent 2 decades learning to read environments for threats and opportunities, for the small tells that revealed power dynamics and potential dangers. Daniel gestured toward a chair with a hand that trembled slightly, then seemed to think better of the hospitality, letting his arm drop back to his side as if unsure what protocol applied when the man whose life you'd destroyed showed up at your door, carrying evidence of your crime. The television was still audible from another room, and Daniel moved to the doorway, calling out to someone named Jennifer that he needed to take a business call. Would she mind keeping the kids occupied for a bit? His voice struggling to maintain normalcy, even as Marcus could see the panic crystallizing in his posture, in the way he held himself like a man expecting a physical blow. The response came back cheerful and unconcerned, a woman's voice saying something about homework and bedtime, the ordinary negotiations of family life proceeding in complete ignorance of the fact that everything was about to fracture, that the foundation they'd built their lives upon was revealed as unstable, as fundamentally compromised by secrets that had been festering in the darkness for 2 decades. Daniel closed the door to the living room and then just stood there, his back against the wood, his face showing the complex mathematics of someone trying to calculate if there was any possible way to make this situation less catastrophic than it appeared, if money could solve it, if threats could contain it, if some combination of explanation and appeal might somehow convince Marcus to simply walk away and let the lie continue its successful masquerade as truth. Marcus remained standing, refusing to sit because sitting would imply a conversation between equals, when what was happening here was a reckoning. Was the inevitable consequence of Daniel's choice to prioritize his own freedom over another man's life, to let the justice system grind an innocent person into powder, while he went about his business, building a company and a family, and a reputation that would all come crashing down once the truth emerged. The folder in Marcus's hands felt heavy now, weighted not with paper, but with the accumulated evidence of Daniel's guilt, with witness statements that had been conveniently ignored, with security footage that placed Daniel at the scene when his alibi claimed he was elsewhere, with financial records that showed motive, with all the pieces that should have been assembled 20 years ago if the investigators had been more interested in truth than in closing cases efficiently. Marcus placed the folder on the coffee table between them with deliberate care, like a dealer revealing the winning hand, and then finally spoke again, his voice steady now, powered by the moral certainty of someone who'd survived hell and emerged with his integrity somehow intact. 20 years, Daniel, Marcus said, and the simple statement carried more weight than any elaborate accusation could have, because those 2 words contained 7,300 days of suffering, of loss, of time stolen and life eroded and opportunities destroyed, of watching his daughter grow up through photographs his sister sent, of his wife's visits becoming less frequent until they stopped altogether, of birthdays spent in a cell counting ceiling tiles while Daniel celebrated his own with cake and candles, and the comfortable ignorance of someone who'd successfully compartmentalized his crime. Daniel opened his mouth and then closed it again, seeming to understand that anything he said right now would only make things worse, would reveal the inadequacy of language to address the magnitude of what he'd done. And Marcus continued, his words coming faster now, propelled by 20 years of rehearsal, of imaginary conversations conducted in the privacy of his cell, while his cellmate snored and the prison settled into its nocturnal rhythms of violence and despair. 20 years while you built this, Marcus gestured at the room, at the evidence of prosperity and normalcy. while you slept in a bed with your wife and ate meals at a table and walked outside whenever you wanted, while I fought for my life every single day in a place designed to break people, designed to grind them down until there's nothing left but anger and survival instinct. Daniel's face had gone pale, the comfortable tan of someone who probably played golf and took vacations to tropical destinations, fading into a sickly pallor that suggested his body was beginning to understand what his mind maybe hadn't fully processed yet. That this wasn't going to end well, that there was no negotiation possible here, that Marcus hadn't come for money or apology, but for something much more fundamental. "I didn't know," Daniel said finally, the words coming out desperate and unconvincing, and Marcus felt something close to contempt rise in his throat. Because of course Daniel had known, had read about the arrest in the newspapers, had maybe even attended the trial to watch the system do his work for him, had certainly been aware that someone else was paying the price for his actions. And claiming ignorance now was just another form of cowardice, another way of trying to minimize the moral weight of what he'd done. Marcus shook his head slowly, refusing to grant Daniel the comfort of that particular lie, and said, "You knew. Maybe not at first. Maybe you told yourself it would all work out, that the truth would emerge, that you wouldn't really have to make a choice. But there came a moment, probably when the verdict was read, maybe earlier, when you knew that I was going to prison for what you did, and you made a decision. You decided that your life was worth more than mine, that your freedom mattered more than my innocence, and you've been living with that decision for 20 years while I've been dying with it." The room felt smaller now, compressed by the pressure of accumulated truth, by the presence of something that couldn't be contained or dismissed or explained away, and Marcus could see Daniel's mind racing through scenarios, through possible futures, through the catastrophic cascade of consequences that would follow if Marcus went to the police with the evidence in that folder. If the comfortable lie of Daniel's respectable life was exposed as exactly that, a lie, a performance, a carefully maintained illusion that was about to be shattered by the inconvenient return of the man who was supposed to have been permanently disappeared by the justice system's efficient machinery. "What do you want?" Daniel asked. And the question revealed so much about how he understood the world, about his assumption that everything could be transacted, that problems could be solved with the right combination of resources and negotiation, that Marcus's suffering could somehow be compensated or contained if only the price was right. Marcus felt a laugh build in his chest, bitter and harsh. Because the question itself was so fundamentally wrong, so divorced from the reality of what had happened, from the existential devastation of having your entire life stolen and being expected to emerge from that experience with wants that could be satisfied by anything Daniel could offer. "I want the 20 years back," Marcus said quietly. "I want to watch my daughter grow up. I want my marriage to survive. I want to wake up in the morning without the muscle memory of checking for threats, without the hypervigilance that prison welds into your nervous system. I want to not have scars from fights I didn't start. I want to have a career, a retirement account, friends who didn't disappear because they couldn't reconcile my conviction with their memories of who I was. I want 1,000 things you can't give me, Daniel, because you can't undo time. You can't restore what was taken." Daniel's legs seemed to give out, and he sank into the chair behind him, his head dropping into his hands, and Marcus wondered if this was genuine remorse or just fear of consequences, if Daniel was mourning what he'd done to Marcus or what was about to happen to himself. The folder lay between them like evidence at trial, and Marcus moved to sit finally, not because he'd been invited, but because his own legs were shaking now with the emotional intensity of this confrontation, with the release of 20 years of carefully controlled rage into this moment of truth-telling that felt both satisfying and insufficient. both powerful and somehow hollow, because no reckoning could actually restore what had been lost. No justice at this late stage could return the stolen decades, or repair the psychological damage, or resurrect the relationships that had died while Marcus was locked away. He opened the folder and pulled out the first document, a security camera, still that showed Daniel's car near the scene of the crime at the exact time his alibi claimed he was home, and placed it on the coffee table where Daniel couldn't avoid seeing it, couldn't pretend it didn't exist. Then another document, a witness statement from someone who'd seen Daniel that night, had mentioned it to police, but whose information had been filed away rather than investigated, because they'd already had their suspect, already had Marcus in custody, already had the easy solve that meant they could close the case and move on. One by one, Marcus laid out the evidence like cards in a game of solitaire, each piece adding to the picture of Daniel's guilt, each document representing hours of work by Patricia Chen, the private investigator who'd believed in Marcus's innocence and had dedicated 3 years of her life to proving what the original investigation should have discovered if anyone had bothered to look beyond the convenient narrative that fit their prejudices and their productivity metrics. Daniel sat motionless as Marcus methodically displayed the evidence, each document a brick in a wall of truth that was steadily enclosing him, cutting off escape routes and alternative narratives, leaving him trapped with the undeniable reality of his own guilt. And Marcus found himself studying Daniel's face with the intensity of someone who'd spent 20 years imagining this moment, trying to understand what kind of person could live comfortably with the knowledge that an innocent man was suffering for his crime. What internal architecture of rationalization and compartmentalization allowed someone to wake up each morning and proceed through their day without being crushed by the weight of that moral failing? The documents on the table between them told a story that should have been told 2 decades ago. Daniel had been involved in something Marcus still didn't fully understand, some business deal gone wrong that had escalated into violence. And when the police came looking for suspects, Daniel had provided an alibi that his wife corroborated, not knowing she was participating in the destruction of a stranger's life, and the investigation had taken the path of least resistance, had found Marcus, who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, who fit the profile they were expecting, who didn't have the resources to mount an adequate defense against a system that was more interested in conviction rates than in discovering truth. Marcus had pieced this together over 3 years of investigation, had read police reports that were riddled with inconsistencies that should have raised questions but didn't, had interviewed witnesses who'd tried to provide information that contradicted the prosecution's theory, but whose statements had been minimized or ignored, had assembled a counter-narrative so compelling that any objective observer would have to conclude that the original verdict was not just wrong, but catastrophically, criminally wrong. The prosecutor knew, Marcus said, pulling out another document, an internal memo from the district attorney's office that Patricia had obtained through sources Marcus didn't ask about, that suggested there were questions about the case's strength, but that the political pressure to secure a conviction had overridden those concerns, that Marcus's life had been sacrificed on the altar of someone's career ambitions, and the public's demand for swift justice, even when that justice was misdirected. Daniel looked at the memo with eyes that seemed unable to fully focus, as if the horror of what he was seeing, the systematic nature of the failure that had enabled his crime to go unpunished while Marcus suffered in his place, was too large to process in its entirety, required being absorbed in fragments over time because the whole picture was simply too devastating to comprehend all at once. Marcus had spent 3 years absorbing this reality, 3 years understanding that his wrongful conviction wasn't just bad luck or a single mistake, but rather the product of a system that functioned exactly as it was designed to function, that prioritized efficiency over accuracy, that treated human lives as acceptable losses in service of maintaining the appearance of order and justice, that was perfectly willing to sacrifice individuals who didn't have the resources or connections to defend themselves adequately against its machinery. He'd learned that wrongful convictions weren't anomalies, but features of a system that rewarded prosecutors for conviction rates rather than for truth-seeking, that gave police incentives to close cases quickly rather than correctly, that provided inadequate resources for public defenders while showering prosecutors with funding and support, that treated the accused as guilty until proven innocent, despite the rhetoric to the contrary. "My daughter was 6 years old when I was arrested," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a softer quality, the hardness that had characterized his earlier words giving way to something more vulnerable, more broken, as he allowed himself to articulate losses that he usually kept locked in the most protected chambers of his heart. Sarah. She had just started first grade. She loved dinosaurs and wanted to be a paleontologist. She would come to me with books from the library and make me read about velociraptors and stegosauruses until I had the facts memorized. Marcus paused, swallowing against the emotion that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure, and continued, "I missed her 7th birthday and her 8th. I missed her first day of middle school. I missed teaching her to drive. I missed her first heartbreak, her high school graduation, her decision to go to college or not go to college, all the moments where a father is supposed to be present, supposed to guide and protect and just witness his child becoming an adult." Daniel's hands were still covering his face, but Marcus could see his shoulders shaking, could see that the impact of these words was penetrating whatever defenses Daniel had constructed against the reality of what his silence had cost. "She stopped visiting me when she turned 12. My ex-wife, Angela, told me it was too hard for Sarah to see me behind glass, to have conversations through phones, to be searched by guards before she could enter the visiting room." And I understood. I told Angela it was okay, that Sarah should have a normal childhood, that she shouldn't have to carry the shame of having a father in prison. The laugh that came out of Marcus then was completely devoid of humor, a sound that belonged in a place where hope went to die, and he said, "But here's what you need to understand, Daniel. She did carry shame. She carried it alone, without me there to help her process it, to explain that I was innocent, to provide the kind of reassurance that only a parent can provide. She carried it while you tucked your children into bed at night, while you attended their school plays and soccer games and all the ordinary sacred moments that constitute childhood." Marcus reached into the folder and pulled out a photograph, one that his sister Diane had sent him 3 years ago, showing Sarah at her college graduation, wearing a cap and gown and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, standing next to Angela and Angela's new husband, a man named Robert, who'd been present for all the moments Marcus had missed, who'd earned Sarah's trust and affection simply by being available, by being free, by not being locked away for a crime he didn't commit. Marcus placed the photograph on the table where Daniel could see it and said, "This is what you took from me. Not just time, not just freedom, but the fundamental relationship that defines who I am as a human being. My daughter grew up thinking her father was a criminal, or worse, knowing I claimed to be innocent, but maybe wondering in her quietest moments if I was lying, if maybe the system was right and I was wrong, because how does a 6-year-old process the complexity of wrongful conviction?" Daniel finally looked up, his face wet with tears that Marcus felt no sympathy for, because tears were cheap compared to the years Daniel had stolen, compared to the suffering he'd enabled through his cowardice. "She wrote me letters for the first 6 years, every week, letters about school and friends and the things she was learning, and then they stopped. Just stopped. No explanation. Just silence." Marcus gathered the documents back into the folder with hands that had steadied now, The initial trembling replaced by a cold clarity that came from having said the things he'd needed to say, from having made Daniel witness the inventory of loss that his crime had generated, the ripple effects that extended far beyond Marcus himself, to touch everyone who'd loved him, everyone who'd depended on him, everyone whose life had been altered by his absence. The private investigator's report was thick, over 300 pages of evidence and analysis and witness statements and expert opinions that collectively built a case for Marcus's innocence so strong that it should have resulted in immediate exoneration, should have triggered a full investigation into how such a catastrophic miscarriage of justice could have occurred, should have led to consequences for the prosecutors and police officers whose negligence or malice or simple indifference had facilitated this travesty. But Marcus knew from experience that institutional accountability was rare, that the system protected itself more vigorously than it protected the people it was supposed to serve. That admitting mistakes of this magnitude would open floodgates of liability and embarrassment that made denial and delay much more attractive options for people whose careers and reputations were at stake. Patricia had warned him that even with this evidence, even with proof of Daniel's guilt and Marcus's innocence, the path to official exoneration would be long and painful, would require lawyers and appeals, and probably years more of fighting against a system that didn't want to acknowledge what it had done. "I could have come here with a gun," Marcus said quietly, the words hanging in the air between them like a confession and a threat and a statement of moral superiority, all compressed into a single sentence. "I thought about it. In prison, weapons aren't hard to acquire if you know the right people, and I knew people. I thought about getting out and coming here and just ending you, making you feel the fear and helplessness that I felt when that jury said guilty, when the judge sentenced me to 25 years, when I understood that no one was going to save me, that I was going to rot in a cage for something I didn't do while you walked around free." Daniel's eyes widened with renewed terror, and Marcus could see him calculating distances, exit routes, whether he could reach the phone before Marcus could reach him. All the survival mathematics that fear generates when violence seems imminent. "But I didn't," Marcus continued, his voice taking on an almost gentle quality that was somehow more frightening than anger would have been. "I didn't because I realized that would make me the thing they said I was. It would validate the verdict. It would let you off easy, actually, because you'd be dead and wouldn't have to face what's coming, wouldn't have to watch your life collapse the way mine did, wouldn't have to experience the betrayal and abandonment and isolation that I lived with for 20 years. Marcus stood up, his body unfolding from the chair with a deliberate slowness that came from a lifetime of moving carefully, of never making sudden gestures that might be interpreted as threatening, of existing in spaces where violence was always a possibility, and survival depended on reading situations correctly and responding appropriately. He picked up the folder and held it against his chest like armor, like a shield constructed from truth and evidence, and the meticulous work of someone who'd believed in him when almost everyone else had given up. "The police are coming, Daniel," Marcus said, and watched the last bit of color drain from Daniel's face, watched hope collapse into resignation, watched a man realize that the comfortable life he'd built was about to be demolished by the truth he'd tried to bury under 2 decades of successful denial. "I called them before I came here, gave them a time to arrive, told them I was going to confront the man who'd let me take the fall for his crime, and that I wanted them here to witness it, to take my statement and his statement and the evidence that proves what really happened 20 years ago." Marcus checked his watch, an old Timex that had been waiting for him in that manila envelope, still running somehow after 2 decades in storage, keeping time even when Marcus's own time had been suspended, frozen, stolen. "They'll be here in about 5 minutes, which means you have 5 minutes to tell me why you let me go to prison, Why my suffering was acceptable collateral damage for your freedom. Daniel's mouth opened and closed several times before words emerged, and when they did, they came out broken and inadequate, fragments of explanation that couldn't possibly justify what he'd done, but that Marcus needed to hear anyway, needed to understand what kind of moral calculus had resulted in his destruction. "I was scared," Daniel said, the words so simple and pathetic that Marcus felt rage build in his chest again, hot and sharp. The business deal had gone wrong. There was money involved, people who were dangerous, and when the violence happened, I panicked. I ran. And when the police started investigating, I told myself that it would work itself out, that they'd find the real truth, that I didn't need to come forward because the system would figure it out. The rationalization was so familiar to Marcus, so predictable, the kind of incremental moral failure that allowed people to commit enormous wrongs while telling themselves they weren't really responsible, that circumstances forced their hand, that they were victims too in some way. "But then they arrested you," Daniel continued, tears streaming down his face now, "and I told myself I'd come forward if you were convicted, that I'd never let an innocent man go to prison. But then the trial happened so fast, and my lawyer said that coming forward would destroy my life, would mean prison time for me, would mean losing my business and my family. And I convinced myself that maybe you'd be acquitted, that maybe the evidence against you wasn't strong enough, that maybe I didn't need to sacrifice everything to fix a situation that would fix itself." Marcus listened to this confession with the detachment of someone hearing a story he'd already guessed at, already reconstructed from fragments and implications, and he realized that Daniel's explanation changed nothing, absolved nothing, because fear didn't justify what he'd done. Because everyone was scared sometimes, and most people didn't respond to their fear by letting innocent strangers rot in prison for decades. "You convinced yourself," Marcus repeated, the words heavy with contempt. "You convinced yourself that your comfort was worth more than my life, that your children deserved their father more than my daughter deserved hers, that your fear of consequences was more important than my actual experience of those consequences." Outside, Marcus could hear the sound of sirens approaching, growing louder, the mechanical wail of justice delayed, but finally arriving, and he saw Daniel hear them too, saw his face crumple with the realization that this was really happening, that the reckoning he'd avoided for 20 years was about to consume everything he'd built on the foundation of Marcus's stolen life. "When they ask me what I want," Marcus said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "I'm going to tell them I want you to experience what I experienced. I want you to sit in a cell and count the days. I want you to miss your children's lives while they grow up wondering who you really are. I want you to feel the walls close in and the time stretch out and the hope drain away slowly until there's nothing left but the determination to survive one more day. I want justice, Daniel. Finally, after 20 years, I want justice." Indeed, the police cars pulled up outside, with lights rotating in red and blue patterns that painted the interior of Daniel's living room in alternating colors of emergency and consequence, transforming the comfortable domestic space into something resembling a crime scene, which Marcus supposed it was in a way. The place where a 20-year deception was finally being exposed to the harsh light of official scrutiny and legal accountability. Daniel stood frozen in the center of the room, his body rigid with the paralysis that comes from knowing that movement won't change anything, that the moment he'd feared for 2 decades had arrived, and no amount of charm or explanation or desperation would alter what was about to happen. Marcus moved to the window and watched as 4 officers emerged from 2 patrol cars, their movements professional and alert, and behind them a detective's sedan parked with slightly less urgency. And from this vehicle emerged a woman Marcus recognized from the photographs Patricia had shown him, Detective Lisa Morrison, one of the few members of the original investigation team who'd had reservations about the case against Marcus, who'd written reports noting inconsistencies that were subsequently ignored, who'd eventually left the police force over frustrations with a system that seemed more interested in clearing cases than in solving them correctly. Patricia had contacted Morrison 3 months ago, had shown her the evidence they'd compiled, and Morrison had agreed to help, had used her connections and knowledge of procedure to ensure that when this confrontation happened, it would be documented properly, that Daniel wouldn't be able to slip away again, that the justice system would finally have to confront its catastrophic failure and try to make something resembling amends. The doorbell rang with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence of the living room, and Daniel looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed terror and something that might have been pleading, as if even now he thought there might be a way to avoid this. A last-minute negotiation that could postpone or prevent the consequences that were literally standing on his front porch, waiting to be let in. Marcus walked to the door himself, not asking Daniel's permission, because this was Marcus's moment, his reckoning, his justice after 20 years of forced patience, and he wasn't going to let Daniel control even the smallest aspect of how it unfolded. He opened the door to find Detective Morrison standing at the front of the group, her face showing professional neutrality, but her eyes revealing something warmer, something that looked like vindication mixed with the anger of someone who'd been proven right too late to prevent enormous suffering, but at least in time to correct the mistake before it extended into a 3rd decade. "Mr. Freeman," she said formally, her voice carrying into the house where Daniel could hear, establishing for the record who was the victim and who was the perpetrator, who had earned the right to be addressed with respect and who was about to lose that privilege, along with everything else. "We're here in response to your call. Is Daniel Cross inside?" Marcus nodded and stepped aside, allowing the officers to enter, and he watched as they filed into the living room, with the controlled alertness of people who'd walked into unknown situations countless times and knew that even the most apparently straightforward calls could turn dangerous without warning. Daniel remained standing in the center of the room, and Marcus saw the moment when Jennifer, Daniel's wife, appeared in the doorway from the kitchen, drawn by the sound of voices and the impossible presence of police officers in her living room, her face cycling through confusion and concern as she took in the scene. Her husband, standing rigid and pale, a black man she didn't recognize holding a folder, uniformed officers positioned around the room, and Detective Morrison introducing herself with the kind of professional courtesy that somehow made everything more ominous rather than less. "Daniel," Jennifer said, the name coming out as a question loaded with 1,000 implications, a request for explanation that Daniel seemed completely unable to provide, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound, his hands hanging at his sides like disconnected appendages that no longer knew what function they were supposed to serve. Marcus watched Jennifer's face as understanding began to penetrate, as she looked between her husband and the police and Marcus and the folder and started piecing together a narrative that her mind probably resisted, even as her instincts recognized that something fundamental had shifted, that the ordinary Thursday evening she'd been experiencing was in fact something else entirely, something that was going to change everything about her life and her family and her understanding of the man she'd built that life with. Morrison asked Jennifer to have a seat, her tone gentle but firm, and Jennifer complied with the automatic obedience of someone who'd never had negative interactions with police, who'd been raised to see law enforcement as protection rather than threat. And Marcus felt a complicated emotion watching her, sympathy for what she was about to experience mixed with a hard core of something darker that noted she'd had 20 years of normal life while his own family had been torn apart. Detective Morrison turned to Marcus first, establishing his status as victim rather than suspect, making clear through the order of her questions and the tone of her voice that whatever was about to happen here, Marcus was the wronged party, the person around whom the justice system should orient itself rather than the person it should suspect. She asked him to explain why he'd called, what evidence he had, what had brought him to Daniel Cross's home on this particular evening, and Marcus walked her through the timeline methodically. His release that afternoon, the decision to confront Daniel before taking the evidence to official channels, the desire to see Daniel's face when he was finally forced to acknowledge what he'd done and what it had cost. Marcus handed her the folder and watched as she opened it, her trained eyes scanning the documents with a speed that came from years of reading reports and evidence files, and he saw her expression shift from professional interest to something harder, something angry, as she absorbed the implications of what she was seeing. The proof that Marcus's wrongful conviction hadn't been just bad luck, but rather the product of investigative failures that should have been caught, should have triggered questions, should never have resulted in the verdict that had stolen 20 years of his life. She looked up from the folder and met Marcus's eyes, and in that moment of connection, Marcus felt something inside him begin to unlock, some tightly held tension that had sustained him through 2 decades of fighting and surviving and refusing to let the injustice break him completely. And he had to look away because the validation in her eyes was almost too much to bear, was threatening to crack the careful emotional control he'd maintained for so long. Morrison turned to Daniel then, and her voice lost the gentleness it had held when addressing Marcus and Jennifer, taking on the harder edge of someone speaking to a suspect, to someone who'd committed a crime and needed to be made to understand that the game was over, that the comfortable deception had reached its expiration date. Daniel Cross, I need you to understand that anything you say from this point forward can and will be used against you in a court of law, she began, delivering the Miranda warning with the practiced cadence of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. And Marcus watched Daniel's face as the reality of his situation crystallized into something undeniable, as whatever fantasies of escape or explanation he'd been entertaining dissolved in the face of official process and legal consequence. Morrison asked Daniel if he understood his rights, and Daniel nodded, then seemed to understand that wasn't sufficient, that he needed to verbally confirm his comprehension, and managed to whisper yes in a voice that barely qualified as audible. I'm going to ask you some questions about the night of October 15th, 20 years ago, Morrison continued, pulling out a small recorder and setting it on the coffee table next to the evidence folder, creating a record that would exist beyond this room, beyond this moment, beyond any possibility of denial or revision. But first I need to know, did you witness or participate in the assault and robbery of Michael Thompson on that night? The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by thread, like judgment waiting to fall, and Marcus held his breath waiting for Daniel's response, waiting to see if he would finally tell the truth after 2 decades of silence. Daniel looked at his wife, and Marcus saw in that glance a lifetime of small deceptions crystallizing into this one enormous lie that had sustained itself through daily omissions and careful compartmentalization, through Daniel's ability to separate his crime from his identity, to be a good husband and father and businessman, while somehow not allowing the knowledge of what he'd done to Marcus to penetrate the walls he'd built around that information. Jennifer was staring at her husband with an expression that suggested she was watching someone she thought she knew transform into a stranger. And Marcus recognized that expression because he'd seen it on Angela's face during his trial, the horrible disorientation of having your reality revealed as false, of discovering that the person you'd trusted completely had been hiding something so fundamental that it called into question everything you thought you knew about them. I was there, Daniel said finally. the words coming out barely above a whisper, and Jennifer made a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a sob, pressing her hand against her mouth as if she could somehow contain the horror that was spilling into her understanding. I was there, and There was a fight, and I ran. And when Marcus was arrested, I told myself it would work out. That I didn't need to say anything because the system would figure out the truth. But then he was convicted, and I was too scared to come forward because I knew what it would mean for me, for my family, for everything I'd built. The confession was spilling out now in a rush, as if Daniel's ability to contain the truth had finally been exhausted by the effort of maintaining the lie for so long. And Marcus listened to it with an expression that revealed nothing, while inside he felt something enormous shifting, some burden he'd carried for 20 years, beginning to transfer from his shoulders to Daniel's, where it had always belonged. Morrison let Daniel talk. Let the confession unspool into the recorder while the uniformed officers maintained their positions around the room, and Jennifer sat frozen on the couch, crying silently, and Marcus understood that this was a professional decision, that Morrison was allowing Daniel to incriminate himself thoroughly before any lawyer could arrive to shut down the conversation, was giving him enough rope to hang himself with his own words, while simultaneously documenting for the record what Marcus had always known, what the justice system should have discovered 20 years ago if it had functioned the way it claimed to function. When Daniel finally ran out of words, when the confession had exhausted itself into silence, Morrison nodded to one of the uniformed officers who stepped forward with handcuffs that caught the light from the rotating police cars outside, metal circles that would soon close around Daniel's wrists and begin his education in powerlessness, in being subject to the will of systems and authorities he couldn't control, in living at the mercy of institutions that saw him as a number rather than a person. Daniel Cross, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, perjury, and will be investigating potential charges related to the original crime, Morrison said, her voice steady and official and somehow satisfying to Marcus's ears. These words he'd dreamed of hearing applied to the right person finally. Finally, after 20 years of nightmare. The officer approached Daniel with the handcuffs, and Daniel didn't resist, just stood there with his hands behind his back, accepting the metal bracelets like a man who'd always known this moment would come, who'd been waiting for it the way Marcus had been waiting for freedom. Both of them suspended in anticipation of this reckoning that would transform both their lives irrevocably. Jennifer watched her husband being handcuffed, with an expression that Marcus recognized from his own experience, the horrible cognitive dissonance of watching someone you love being treated as a criminal, being processed through the dehumanizing machinery of arrest and detention, and Marcus felt simultaneously grateful that she was experiencing this, and guilty for that gratitude, because Jennifer hadn't done anything wrong except love a man who'd hidden something monstrous from her, who'd built their entire life together on the foundation of a lie so enormous that its revelation would necessarily destroy everything that had been constructed atop it. She stood suddenly, moving toward Daniel as if to comfort him or protect him or somehow intervene in what was happening, but Morrison gently intercepted her, explaining in a voice that managed to be both firm and compassionate that she couldn't touch Daniel right now, that this was an official arrest and there were procedures that needed to be followed. And Jennifer's face crumpled with the realization that her husband was being taken away, that he was transitioning from the man she woke up beside to a suspect in custody, from partner to prisoner in the space of minutes. Marcus thought about his own arrest, about how Angela had tried to explain to Sarah what was happening while Marcus was being led away in handcuffs, About how his last sight of his daughter had been her confused 6-year-old face pressed against the apartment window, watching her father disappear into the back of a police car. And he wondered if Daniel's children were somewhere in this house right now, if they were witnessing their father's arrest, or if Jennifer had managed to keep them occupied elsewhere, if they would understand tonight what was happening, or if the full horror would unfold gradually over days and weeks as the truth became impossible to conceal. The officers led Daniel toward the door, and as they passed, Marcus, their eyes met for a brief moment, and Marcus saw in Daniel's face not anger or defiance, but something that looked almost like relief. Like the exhaustion of maintaining a lie for 20 years had been its own form of imprisonment, and now that the lie was exposed, Daniel could finally stop pretending, could finally acknowledge what he'd done and what it had cost, even though that acknowledgement would destroy his life in the process. Marcus didn't feel satisfaction, exactly, didn't feel the surge of triumph he'd sometimes imagined he would experience when this moment finally arrived, but rather something more complex and subdued, a recognition that justice, after this long of a delay, was necessarily incomplete, that nothing that happened to Daniel from this point forward would restore the years Marcus had lost, or repair the damage that had been done to his relationships and his psyche and his fundamental understanding of the world as a place where truth mattered and innocence was protected. He watched Daniel being guided into the back of one of the patrol cars, watched the door close and the officer check the lock, and thought about how strange it was that he was standing here free while Daniel was now the one in custody, how their positions had reversed but in a way that brought no real satisfaction, only a weary acknowledgement that some forms of harm couldn't be undone no matter how thoroughly the perpetrator was punished. The patrol car pulled away from the curb, its lights still rotating but its siren silent, and Marcus tracked it with his eyes until it turned the corner and disappeared from view, taking Daniel Cross away from the comfortable life he'd built and toward a future that would include cells and guards and all the indignities that Marcus knew intimately, that he wouldn't wish on anyone, but that seemed like the only possible consequence for what Daniel had done. Detective Morrison approached Marcus as the second patrol car followed the first, leaving behind only her sedan and the two of them standing in Daniel Cross's driveway, while Jennifer remained inside the house, probably trying to process what had just happened, probably beginning to understand that her life had just fractured into before and after, that everything she thought she knew about her marriage and her husband and her family's history had been revealed as false, or at least fundamentally incomplete. Morrison looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with personal regret, and she said, "I'm sorry this took so long. I'm sorry we didn't get it right the first time. I'm sorry you lost 20 years because the system failed you." The apology was genuine. Marcus could tell, could hear in her voice that she meant it, but he also understood that apologies from individuals couldn't address systemic failures, that Morrison's regret didn't change the fact that the entire machinery of justice, from the police investigation to the prosecution to the trial to the appeals process, had worked exactly as it was designed to work, protecting itself and its own interests, rather than protecting someone like Marcus, who didn't have the resources or connections to force the system to function correctly. "Thank you," Marcus said, because Morrison had helped, had used her position and her knowledge to ensure that tonight went smoothly, that Daniel was arrested and the evidence was officially entered into the record, and the process of Marcus's exoneration could finally begin in earnest, and that help deserved acknowledgement even if it came 20 years too late to prevent the suffering it was meant to address. Morrison pulled out a business card and handed it to Marcus, explaining that he'd need to come to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement, that there would be paperwork and procedures and probably weeks or months of legal process before his conviction was officially overturned and he was formally exonerated, that the system moved slowly even when correcting its own mistakes. maybe especially when correcting its own mistakes, because admitting error opened up questions of liability and competence that the institutions involved would want to manage carefully. Marcus took the card and put it in his pocket, feeling the weight of what still remained to be done, the marathon of bureaucracy he'd have to run before his innocence was officially recognized, before the record was corrected and his name was cleared and he could theoretically move forward with his life. Whatever that meant for a 58-year-old man who'd spent 2 decades in prison and emerged with no job prospects, no savings, no social network beyond the few people who'd maintained faith in him. No clear path toward anything resembling the normal life he'd been living before his arrest. Morrison seemed to read something in his expression because she said, "There are resources available for people in your situation. Organizations that help with housing, employment, counseling. I can connect you with people who specialize in helping the wrongfully convicted rebuild their lives." Marcus nodded, grateful for the information, but also aware that no amount of resources could fully compensate for what had been taken. That rebuilding a life at 58 with a 20-year gap in your employment history and trauma that penetrated to your bones was a fundamentally different prospect than simply continuing the life that had been interrupted. Morrison left after extracting a promise from Marcus that he'd come to the station in the morning, and Marcus stood alone in the driveway for a long moment, listening to the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening. Televisions playing in distant rooms, a dog barking 3 houses down, the rustle of wind through the trees that lined the street, and marveling at how normal everything seemed despite what had just occurred, how the world continued in its routines even when individual lives were being transformed by events of enormous significance. He thought about going back inside to check on Jennifer, to say something, though he wasn't sure what. Wasn't sure if she'd want to see him, or if his presence would just be a reminder of everything her husband had done, everything her life had been built upon that was now revealed as false. He decided against it, recognizing that Jennifer needed space to process what had happened without having to perform composure or manage her emotions for the benefit of the man her husband had wronged. Marcus walked back toward the street, intending to call a taxi, to find a motel for the night since he had no home to return to. No place in the world that was his, except for the halfway house he'd been assigned to and had never actually checked into. But before he could pull out his phone, he heard the front door of Daniel's house open again, and Jennifer stepped onto the porch, her face blotchy from crying, but her posture somehow determined, as if she'd made a decision and needed to act on it before her courage failed. She walked toward Marcus with careful steps, and when she reached him, she stopped a few feet away, maintaining distance, as if unsure whether closeness was appropriate or welcome, and Marcus waited for her to speak, to say whatever she'd come out here to say, giving her the time and space to formulate words for a situation that probably defied easy articulation. "I didn't know," she said finally, and Marcus heard in her voice the desperation of someone who needed to be believed, who needed him to understand that she'd been deceived along with everyone else, that she wasn't complicit in what Daniel had done, wasn't part of the conspiracy that had stolen Marcus's life. When the police questioned him 20 years ago, when he told me he'd been home that night, I backed him up because I believed him, because I had no reason not to believe him, because I couldn't imagine that he would lie about something so serious, something that would affect another person's life so profoundly. Tears were streaming down her face again, and Marcus felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name, something between compassion and resentment, between understanding that she was a victim of Daniel's deception and bitterness that her unknowing participation in that deception had contributed to his conviction, had provided Daniel with the alibi that allowed him to escape scrutiny while Marcus's life was destroyed. "I believe you," Marcus said, because he did, because the genuine horror on her face when Daniel confessed had been impossible to fake, had revealed someone discovering that their entire life had been built on lies. And while that didn't absolve her of responsibility for providing the false alibi, it did mean that she'd been used by Daniel just as thoroughly as Marcus had been, just in a different way with different consequences. Jennifer nodded, seeming to absorb his words, to take some small comfort from the fact that Marcus didn't hold her personally responsible for what her husband had done. And then she said something that surprised Marcus with its directness, its refusal to hide behind euphemism or deflection. "My children are going to ask me questions, and I don't know how to answer them. I don't know how to explain that their father let an innocent man go to prison for 20 years, that their entire childhood has been built on the foundation of someone else's suffering, that the man they love and trust did something so morally bankrupt that it calls into question everything I've taught them about right and wrong, about integrity and courage, and taking responsibility for your actions." She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand in a gesture that seemed childlike, vulnerable, and continued, "I'm going to tell them the truth. I'm not going to protect Daniel's image or make excuses for what he did. They deserve to know who their father really is, what he's capable of, so they can decide for themselves how they want to relate to that knowledge, what kind of relationship they want to have with him going forward." Marcus felt something unexpected hearing this. Respect, maybe, for Jennifer's determination to prioritize truth over comfort, to refuse to participate in the kind of denial that had allowed Daniel to live comfortably with his guilt for 2 decades. He thought about Sarah, about how he'd never had the chance to explain his innocence to her in person, about how she'd grown up with a version of events that was false but that he'd had no opportunity to correct. And he wondered if she would believe him now that his innocence was finally being proven, if the evidence would be enough to overcome 20 years of believing her father was guilty, if their relationship could ever be repaired after such a profound breach of trust, even though the breach hadn't been his fault. Marcus Freeman spent his first night of freedom in a budget motel, unable to sleep as his body remained conditioned by 20 years of prison hypervigilance, counting ceiling tiles and processing the strange reality that Daniel Cross was now experiencing his first night in a cell, while Marcus lay in relative comfort yet found no satisfaction in the reversal, recognizing that Daniel's punishment would never restore what had been stolen from him. The morning brought him to a diner where simple choices overwhelmed him, where a waitress named Shirley recognized the weight he carried, and where he ate eggs that tasted like resurrection while contemplating the impossible task of reconnecting with his sister Diane and daughter Sarah, people who'd known a version of Marcus Freeman that no longer existed, that had been transformed by suffering into something harder and more damaged than the man they'd loved. At the police station, Marcus gave Detective Morrison a 3-hour statement that became a cathartic unburdening of 20 years of accumulated trauma, speaking aloud for the first time about suicide attempts and the erosion of hope and his daughter's face disappearing from the visiting room. And when he finally walked out into the afternoon sunlight and called his sister Diane, her immediate and fierce response, "I know, baby brother, I always knew, come home right now," broke something open inside him, made him understand that while justice had arrived too late to prevent catastrophic suffering, it had come in time to give him a chance to rebuild some version of a life from the ruins, and that his true freedom wasn't granted by the state or secured by Daniel's arrest, but rather earned in that moment at Daniel's door when he chose justice over revenge. Chose to remain human rather than become the monster that injustice tried to create. A choice that prison couldn't take and time couldn't diminish, and no system could ever steal from him again.